Hey everybody, I'm Zoe,
And I'm Chandi.
and this is Bound by the Cloak. Before there were FBI agents or modern detectives, there was one man whose name became synonymous with pursuit, secrecy, and power. This man was Allan Pinkerton. He claimed to have saved Abraham Lincoln from assassination. He hunted down train robbers and outlaws across the frontier, and he built a private detective agency so vast that its name still echoes more than a century later.
However, behind the legend lies a more complicated truth. Pinkerton was both a defender of presidents and a nemesis to striking workers. He stood for justice, yet he also pioneered a culture of surveillance that still shapes America today. Our guest, historian Rhodri Jeffreys-Jones, takes us inside this world in his new book, Allan Pinkerton, America's Legendary Detective and the Birth of Private Security. We will learn the story of a man who helped invent modern security and the legacy that he left behind, which is both controversial and fascinating.
Thank you so much for being on the show today, Rhodri.
My pleasure.
Could you start by introducing yourself?
I'm a retired historian who was at Edinburgh University for 40 years as a teacher, but I spent 5 years in the United States, a couple of years in the Middle West, and a year on the East Coast, some time in Washington, D.C., and spread around different places. So I've got to know a fair amount of the United States, but my one blank is really the South. I haven't been to the South very much.
And, obviously we're here to talk about your new book. Your new book is about Allan Pinkerton. What drew you to the world of spies, surveillance, and secrets?
Well, that's an interesting question. I had a godmother who was a psychiatrist, and she was very keen on psychoanalyzing my motives. She was acquainted with a study that had been done in the Tavistock Institute in London into the reason why spies and terrorists were the people they were. And they came up with the theory that it was a split personality, not in the clinical sense of having a split personality, but being able to perform two roles and live two lives quite separately without getting confused. So sometimes I've analysed myself to ask myself whether I fit into that category, but I think the answer is no. I think much more plausible is the fact that my original PhD thesis was on violence in industrial relations in the United States. When researching into that, I came across the role of detective agencies, including the role played by Allan Pinkerton and his National Detective Agency. And then one day I was talking to a friend of mine who was from Yugoslavia, and he drew my attention to a collection in the Sterling Library in Yale, the papers of Somerset Maugham, the English novelist. And in the period of the Bolshevik takeover in Russia, Somerset Maugham was sent to St. Petersburg as an agent, acting for the British, but paid by the Americans. So he also informed the Americans about what was going on and gave a blow-for-blow account of what the Bolsheviks were doing in St. Petersburg. And that led to an article. And just at that point, a great scandal was erupting in the United States over the role of the CIA in assassinations and other clandestine activities. So it took me into the study of spies. Nobody had written about this from the academic point of view. So I wrote a book about the history of American espionage. And that then took me into writing history of the CIA, history of the FBI. But all the time, I maintained my interest in Allan Pinkerton. So when I visited Washington, D.C., I dropped into the Library of Congress manuscript room where they hold the letter books, that is, his correspondence from the 19th century. So I went through those and I had those on file. And a little bit later, I got in touch with a lady called Jane Adler. Jane Adler was someone who was retained by the Pinkerton Agency around 1999 because they were going to hand over all their papers to the Library of Congress, not just the Pinkerton correspondence. So I interviewed her a couple of times and she sent me some documents which were not available elsewhere. Not very long after that, an American corporation called ProQuest decided to put everything on the web to make it digitally approachable. And that was just not just the Pinkerton papers, but also the context of the labour movements, business leaders at the time, so that you were able to research not only Pinkerton, but the whole of the context in which he operated, and the same for his agency. Well, nobody had looked at this material in any systematic way, and I thought this was a great opportunity, and so I produced a book.
And so your latest book, Allan Pinkerton, America's Legendary Detective and the Birth of Private Security. So it's part biography, but also talks about the origin story of modern private security. So can you tell us more about the book?
Well, the book falls into two parts. The first part is a biography of Pinkerton, his emigration from Scotland, his involvement in the anti-slavery movement, his friendship with Abraham Lincoln, his effort in saving Lincoln from assassination in 1861, and so on. So I deal with Allan Pinkerton's life all the way up until his death in 1884. But when he died, he handed the agency on to his two sons, William and Robert, who managed the agency. Then they handed it on to another generation, Allan Pinkerton, and then yet another generation, Robert A. Pinkerton II, who continued to be in charge up until his death in 1967. And thereafter, the Pinkerton Agency continued to operate as an independent organization until it was taken over by Securicor, the Swedish-based international company, around 1999. It still exists as a subdivision of Securicor and operates on a worldwide basis. So I decided to look at both the biographical story of Allan Pinkerton, and then what happened to the agency afterwards. You mentioned the contribution that his agency made to private security. This is, of course, the business he operated in the 19th century, and that was before you really had any systematic police force in the United States, certainly no detective force of any consequence. So he really saw himself as supplying a need that the federal governments, state governments, and city governments did not supply when he started out in business. As regular police forces developed, he grew to be quite critical of them because he said they're corrupt. And if you want a proper police and detective service, you've got to go down the private avenue. He was a great advocate of private enterprise, down the line anti-communist and all the rest of it, anti-statist. So he set that example, constructed that model. But in 1892, there was a very controversial labor strike in Homestead, Massachusetts, which discredited the Pinkerton Agency. And the following year, Congress passed the anti-Pinkerton law, the main provision of which was that the Pinkerton Agency, and it applied to all the detective agencies and private security agencies, because people refer to a phenomenon known as Pinkertonism. All these private agencies should be banned from federal employment. That is quite remarkable when you think of it, because 2 world wars occurred, when the government might have resorted to hiring private security people, but that didn't happen. Well, things began to change in the 20th century. One significant thing was that in the 1930s, there was a major investigation of the Pinkerton Agency when it was finally proved that they got most of their money by doing labour work. And that was their main source of income. And as a result of the pressure exerted by Congress and public opinion, the Pinkertons had to give up labour work, which cut their source of income just like that. So then Robert A. Pinkerton II, who was actually a very astute businessman, went into security, private security, but not supplying the federal government or any other government agency, and built it up into a thriving business worth many millions of pounds by the time he went corporate and died in 1967. But then there was a court case called the Fairfax case shortly after that. Fairfax was a credit company, a credit checking company. What they did was they acted for businessmen who wanted to know about the reliability of other businessmen, especially in a country as large as the United States. If you see a business opportunity and you live in Boston and you want to deal with someone in San Francisco, you can see that in principle it's a good thing. But what's the guy at the other end like? So Fairfax supplied that kind of service. And they wanted to hire Pinkertons to do some of the detective work for them, finding out about the financial reliability of the people that they were dealing with. But they were challenged in the courts under the terms of the anti-Pinkerton law. But the federal court decided that their business was okay and they could supply some of that service to their employers, who were in fact employed by the federal government. So that was getting in by the back door, as it were. Then there was another case in the Bush administration after 2000 also, the Scott's case, which cleared the road legally for private firms to work for the federal government. Then you had a great accelerator, which was 9/11. And all of a sudden, the federal government needed to expand its security provisions dramatically, very quickly. The Homeland Security Act was passed, for example, and it meant almost 250,000 people were hired, and they were almost all hired from private companies like the Pinkertons, although by that stage, other companies like Blackwater had come onto the scene. And so the path was now open for the privatization of national security, so that by the time President Obama achieved office, 70% of the federal intelligence work was done by private companies. Now, you could argue that Pinkerton pioneered that development, but then there was what you might call the Pinkerton delay because of the 1893 Act, which prohibited the Pinkerton Company from doing that work, up until the Fairfax and Scott cases, and then the 9/11 crisis. And then people reverted to this 19th century preference for the federal government to employ private people to look after matters of security.
Let's kind of start at the beginning when it comes to Pinkerton. He's from Scotland. His father was law enforcement, I believe. Can you tell us more about how he grew up in Scotland and kind of what led him to the United States?
Well, his father was, by training, he was a blacksmith, a very strong person physically. But then his health began to break down and he got a job in Glasgow prison, which was constructed just across the River Clyde from where the Pinkerton family lived. So he was a turnkey in the prison, and that's the law enforcement connection. He also had a half-brother because his father's first wife had died, and he had a second family with another woman. He had a half-brother who was in the regular police force. So there was a police connection there, and it's something that a lot of people like to stress about Pinkerton, that he came from that kind of background. But he had to go out to work when he was 11 or 12 years old. And finally, he decided to train a cooper, someone who makes barrels, which in the early 19th century was a very important skill. Beer, salt, fish, everything was kept in barrels. So he got to be a master cooper. Now, he was growing up in Glasgow at a time of considerable political ferment because, unlike the United States, not everybody could vote in Britain. When I say everybody, I mean all men in the United States, virtually all men. Well, excepting for African Americans who were slaves, of course, all men could vote. But this was not the case in Britain, only a tiny minority of landed gentry, aristocrats, and so on. So there was a great agitation in the 1820s and 1830s, but the government was very hostile to this and used ruthless tactics, employed troops to shoot down demonstrations of workers, and also penetrated their ranks with a whole series of spies. That was the kind of background against which Pinkerton grew up. Now, he became a great advocate of revolution. The movement at the time was called the Chartist movement because the way they operated was they got hundreds of thousands and later millions of people to sign a charter which is presented to the government demanding that the vote be extended more broadly, at first to men and women, but they dropped the women, decided to be more cautious, and they wanted it to be extended to all men. So the movement is called the Chartist movement. There were two wings of the Chartist movement. One of them was moral persuasion, use the petition method, write in the press, hold public meetings, that kind of thing. And the other one was the physical force branch. And Pinkerton was a leading advocate of physical force. In other words, if peaceful persuasion does not succeed, let's resort to the use of force. There were those who observed that the marshals of discontent, as they called them, those who took the most prominent roles by, for example, advocating extreme tactics, were the most likely to be informers. And that's why the question arises, was Pinkerton an informer against the Chartist movement for which he was an enthusiast? And it could be a complex aspect of his personality. It could be that he was frightened into doing that. It could be because members of his family were associated with law enforcement. But whether that's true or not, he must have been very aware of the situation at the time where informers were widely used by the government. And people were then arrested, deported. They called it transportation because they'd be transported typically to the country we now call Australia. Many of them never to return. That was their punishment. By the way, one of the interesting things about his attendance in these protest meetings was it was just across the river from where he lived in a place called the Gorbals, across the river from Glasgow. There was a place called Glasgow Green. At one end there was a prison. The rest of the green was a park. and great public meetings were held there to advocate Chartism, but also a series of abolitionists came over from the United States to speak there. And it's very possible that listening to them, Pinkerton became an abolitionist, an anti-slavery person, even before he arrived in the United States. At any rate, we know in 1840 he chaired a meeting in a theatre in Glasgow, in the course of which revolution was advocated. And then all of a sudden he disappears from the record for 2 years. The next mention we have of him is when he's marrying a girl called Joan Carfrae. I say girl because she was a teenager. It's possible that they started to go out together when she was only 13 and he was 21. They get married in the cathedral in Glasgow. And in conformity with the requirements of the church, you have to read the banns or announcements of the wedding for 3 successful Sundays in advance of the wedding. So we know they got married on that day. But it's interesting to me that he got married in that way because the pro-Pinkerton story usually went, he went missing for 2 years because the police were looking for him. He was in hiding. And finally, he escaped to the United States. Another reading is that he was hiding from the Chartists because they were out to get him because they knew he was an informer. It seems to me unlikely, if the police were after him, that he would have had his wedding banns read 3 Sundays in succession because obviously they'd know where he was and they'd arrest him and possibly deport him to Australia. At any rate, they get married and they sail down the River Clyde and across the Atlantic. It's very rough weather and they're shipwrecked on Sable Island, which is a small island off the coast of Newfoundland. But they all survive and they make their way to Montreal, and he works there for a brief period as a cooper. Then he hears there are opportunities in Chicago. So he moves to Chicago, works there for a while. Then he hears there are even greater opportunities in a small community called Dundee, which is partly populated by Scots, because Dundee is a Scottish city, 40 miles northwest of Chicago. Partly Scottish, partly German immigrants, and partly migrants from New England. And there he sets up a very successful business as a cooper. And in the end is employing about 20 men. So he's really made it. And he's committed to that profession until one day he decides to pull down the river looking for some special type of wood that he needs for making his barrels, and happens on a little islet and finds the remains of a campfire. And that's when his career as a detective started.
Pinkerton's life kind of feels like a movie. He foiled an assassination attempt, created the first female detective agency, and later cracked down on workers and unions. How did one man move between such different roles, and how did he see himself?
I think that the way in which he saw himself changed over time. I think it happens to a lot of people. For example, his abolitionism was, in my opinion, it is sincere. You know, he really was anti-slavery. But it also became very advantageous to him because the hour of the abolitionists had arrived. Lincoln became president. The Union won the Civil War. You had the Reconstruction and the Reconstruction Amendments, the Civil Rights Act, the Force Act, the Anti-Ku Klux Klan Act. So the scene was set for people with abolitionist sympathies to succeed. And what's important here is that Northern business saw an opportunity of capitalizing on the success of the Union. For example, restrictions on transcontinental railroad construction and railroad construction generally, which had been impeded by civil rights sentiment in the South. For example, every southern state insisted on having a different gauge for its railroads. So Atlanta had about 7 railroads converging all with different gauges. You had to change train, But the North didn't have those inhibitions, and businesses in the North boomed. And these businesses were the very businesses who were able to give Pinkerton a lot of contracts. So it became in his interest to share the political outlook of these people. I mean, I give the example in the book, he did use some distressing language about black people when they were behaving in a way of which he disapproved, especially when they went on strike. He really uses some obnoxious language. But I don't think that takes away from his credit for being an abolitionist, but he gradually became an opportunist as he succeeded. Temptation of making compromises for the sake of further success increased. And if you think of his attitude towards the labour movements, I mean, when he was in Scotland, he was in favour of workers' rights. There's no question about that. And he wrote a letter when he was already well established in the States. He wrote a letter in 1868 to a newspaper in Glasgow called The Sentinel, which is the main paper that working people read in Scotland, strongly advocating the rights of labour to organise and denouncing employers who treated them badly. But just at that point, he began to undertake his serious labour espionage work in the United States for railroads, coal mining companies, steel companies, and so forth. So you could argue that he's changed his mind, or you could argue that he's a hypocrite. But also, like Andrew Carnegie is another example of this. He kind of split hairs about what he really meant. And so when challenged with this inconsistency, he said that really he was in favour of peaceful organisation. But labour unions, by definition, involved force because they organised picket lines and so on. And he increasingly associated labour unions with violence, especially after the Paris Commune of 1871 to 72, which sent panic waves through Western countries because it was an example of workers taking over a whole city, Paris, for a number of months. And when any labour troubles occurred in the States, people were very afraid that kind of contagion would spread to the United States. He knew about Karl Marx also. Karl Marx wasn't really widely followed in the 1870s, but Pinkerton saw that this guy was going to have influence and denounced him.
I think that's an interesting thought on labor unions, because now when people think of Pinkertons, they kind of associate them still with kind of going against labor unions. And I think it's interesting to kind of hear that side of it, to understand what his thoughts were and where his head was at in terms of his point of view. Because I think people just assume that he was against labor unions in general and against workers' rights, but it doesn't seem that that's the case. So,
yeah, he developed a kind of conspiracy attitude towards labour. For example, the Murray Maguire episode in Pennsylvania, which is very controversial. He talked about inner circle. He was influenced by an Irish immigrant called James McParlin, who was an ardent Catholic, but thought that Catholics in America were being led astray by this insidious labour unionism. And at the time, the Catholic Church was, to begin with, against labour unions. But then, in the famous case in the 1880s, the Catholic Church changed its stance, and there was an encyclical which said it's good to organise into labour unions because of the benefits for the welfare of workers. By the way, this guy, James McParlin, penetrated the Murray Maguires on behalf of the Pinkerton Agency, and McParlin was very keen on this idea that a small conspiratorial group. You hear right-wing populist views. They often speak of a small number of people who are manipulating everybody else. So I think he saw eye to eye with James McParlin.
Your subtitle of your book is really interesting, The Birth of Private Security. So I'm curious, what exactly did Pinkerton start in that realm? And how do we still live in that world that he helped shape?
Well, I think it's the beginning of a discourse about private versus public in general. Pinkerton is one of those who helped to shape American conservative ideology. I mean, he's not the only one by any means, and he's not the most intellectual of them, but he had a big influence because of his writings, because he was a famous figure, and so on. So his extolling of the private against the public had very considerable influence. And people, I think, tend to assume that his views gained the ascendancy that is private is best, more than they actually did, because if you look at American history, there are some great public enterprises. For example, not many people know that the New York and New Jersey Transit Authority is a public authority which owns vast number of enterprises, the tunnels, the trains. Twin Towers was a publicly constructed building, so when it came under attack, people weren't attacking American capitalism. They were attacking a public enterprise, largely populated by public employees. When you make these points, people tend to look at you glassy-eyed. No, America's a land of the free, a land of private enterprise, and that was the self-perception that Pinkerton contributed to in quite an important way. As for his specific business, I mean, he regarded labor unions, I suppose, as a form of collectivism. So he was asserting the individual rights of employers against that. He supplied, in addition to the spies, supplied guards. In strikes, for example, he would supply guards whose purpose, it was said, was to protect property and to protect possible strikebreakers from being beaten up by union pickets. So that supplying of private guards who usually wore some kind of uniform was an important beginning. And he spread that beyond the labor realm. He'd provide security, for example, his sons especially developed this, security at racecourses and dog tracks. They needed security for obvious reasons. There's a lot of money changing hands and large crowds. And the Pinkertons got the contract for doing that work. And later on, the need for that kind of private security undoubtedly existed. For example, in the 1930s, American business engaged in national defense contracts would have very lax security. They were doing very high-tech stuff. America was very technologically advanced, but they took very few precautions to protect their secrets. And they were comprehensively penetrated by German intelligence when Hitler was in charge. He stole all kinds of, the secrets of new American airplanes, computer systems, code-breaking machinery, that kind of thing, just because the employers were so careless. For example, if they were drawing plans of a new piece of machinery, you go through several drafts and they would just throw them in the trash bin. And of course, the spies would come along, have a look at the trash, picked out the scale models. Thank you very much. So there was a need for security. Now, you could argue that all the security should be provided by the federal government, state governments, urban government. But the implications of that would be considerable because you then have a very large force of public police, which might constitute a danger. So, although I'm critical of Pinkerton in many ways, I think he was he had good vision in seeing that kind of facility should be provided privately rather than by governmental institutions. And his ideas were gradually taken up across the nation. For example, in the 1930s, security was tightened up. The FBI, for example, for the first time initiated counterintelligence on a significant scale. But on the local level, the firms would take on private security specialists, and that grew into a significant industry. Whether it's good that it's been done on such a massive scale in the modern period, and the President Bush, for example, after 9/11, is another matter, because the problem is with private companies, as people often say, they owe their chief loyalty to the bottom line, what's going to make them profits, rather than what's good for the nation or good for society. And secondly, your modern corporation tends to be multinational. So do they really owe loyalty to one nation as opposed to another? But I think that's perhaps a separate question. I think the desirability of having private guards in various institutions is probably okay, yeah.
It's funny because living in New Jersey, like you mentioned earlier, and you have Port Authority where they owned World Trade Center station and the buildings and the airport. They own a lot, and they have like their own sort of security as well. It's interesting because I don't think people think about it much. I know I really didn't think about it much at all either.
Some of these companies organize their own security, but they also hire specialist companies quite widely.
A lot of companies do too, yeah. So, obviously Pinkerton wasn't a cop himself, but he had his own resources. What happens when a private citizen builds their own sort of law enforcement empire, in a way? And how does that blur the lines between business and justice?
Well, the trouble with Pinkerton was that he would only serve those who could pay him. And only a minority of people can afford to hire private security people like the Pinkertons. So there's an inherent injustice written into that. Pinkerton really was part of a contemporary problem which is more widespread than that. For example, the only way you could make decent living as a lawyer by the second half of the 19th century was if you worked for a corporation. So almost all lawyers were corporation lawyers. And when it came to a labour dispute where they opposed the union, it wasn't that they were consciously biased. It's just that, that was their way of thinking. What's good for the corporation is good for America. So the working people suffered a lot from that kind of discrimination in the legal system. I think what happened then later on was that the legal profession diversified. For example, the rise of divorce, which is very rare in the middle of the 19th century, but it became increasingly, you have a special class of lawyers who are divorce lawyers. Now, what happens when you appoint judges? You now find that you don't have to appoint a corporation lawyer as a judge. You've got another kind of lawyer you can appoint as well. So as the legal profession diversified, that improved. But in the 19th century, you could argue that Pinkerton was part of the generally oppressive environment as far as the majority of the people of the population were concerned. And there was, if you look at his struggle against outlaws such as the Jesse James brothers, there was huge popular support for the James brothers. Jesse James was, of course, shot in the back by a man called Ford. End of story. But Frank James lived on long enough to be put on trial 3 times for murder. Clearly guilty, I think, in every case. The jury wouldn't convict him. It's not that they were afraid to convict him. They thought, this guy's on the right side. Look who's opposing him. Big business, Pinkertons. This guy's one of us. So, and the James brothers had a kind of Robin Hood reputation. The robbing the rich to give to the poor. That was absolute nonsense. They never gave a penny away to the poor. But people said that about them, not because of who they were, but because of who they opposed. The original Robin Hood, nobody can quite pin him down, but the various candidates in medieval England was exactly the same. He stood up to the sheriff. He opposed the rich, but there's no evidence whatsoever that he gave money away. But that was his reputation, that he was a kind man and so on. But in fact, probably a thug, just like Jesse James. By the way, you asked me earlier what led me to be interested in my subject. And when I was a kid, I had a babysitter who called Ed Larkin, who was an American. And he was very interested in the James brothers and showed me photographs of them, including photographs of Jesse James after he'd been shot, which he really shouldn't have done with a small boy. But it made a vivid impression on me. I also had a friend called Elwyn James, who so admired Jesse James that he insisted he was related to him. He's still a charismatic figure. But he was actually, Jesse James, he was a bushwhacker. He was on the side of the South in the Civil War. His stepfather owned 7 slaves. That's indicative, A, of his likely attitude towards race, but also of his wealth. This guy wasn't poor. He just wanted to make his money fast by using his gun. That was something that Pinkerton failed to understand because, to his credit, he always tried to do what he could for unfortunate people, including people in prison. And he was in favour of prison because his father had been a turnkey in Glasgow in a prison. He wanted to help people in prison, but his prescription was education, typical for a 19th century person to say, you can cure everything through education, and teach them skills so that when they emerge from prison, they can make a living in an honest way. But the assumption there is that they turned to crime in the first place because of ignorance and poverty. Now, this is not always the case.
That thought still persists here in the U.S. in terms of prison, yeah.
You've written about the CIA, FBI, whistleblowers, so this whole world of intelligence and spies. But where do you think Pinkerton fits in the larger timeline of American intelligence, and how do you think his legacy is kind of still showing up today?
Well, I think that some of his methods and practices passed over to the FBI in the first instance and later to the CIA. For example, he operated on a national scale. And one of the problems, America's a federal country, right? So when it comes to law enforcement, the federal government is restricted by constitutional restraints. And even when you've got a government police agency like the Secret Service and the FBI, they can only do what federal law authorizes them to do. So, for example, most murders, I think this is probably still a problem to a certain extent today. You can't put the feds onto the case straight away because unless it's interstate. If it's something that takes place in a political estate, you can't automatically call in the feds. Although I think in practice the FBI makes this technology available quite widely. Now, Pinkerton. In the 19th century, this was even more acute, and there were very few federal detectives. And if you escaped, if you crossed the state boundary, you could get away from the state police, such as they were. Or even if you just left the precincts of Chicago, the Chicago police weren't authorized to cross into the neighboring. Once you left Cook County, that was it. You got away. Pinkerton didn't have any of those restrictions. His men could operate across state lines. They couldn't actually make arrests. They'd have to call in the local policeman to make the arrest, but they could pursue the people. And that is clearly something that creation of the FBI took up, that idea that they could operate on a nationwide basis. Also, some of his specific methodologies, such as mugshots. He was very early into photography and having a bank of photographs of criminals, which could be distributed, copied, and sent across the nation. You see that cropping up in, I think it still exists, the 10 Most Wanted Men is still an FBI tool. And that's, a practical imitation. Fingerprinting was something else which dated back to Pinkerton's practices. But some of the Pinkerton agency's practices were really malpractices also. Sometimes I didn't have great respect for habeas corpus rights and citizens' rights in general. So in one case in the 19th century, for example, someone who was suspected of bank fraud fled to Central America, and the Pinkertons just sent in a team which kidnapped him, put him on a boat, took him back to the United States, put him on trial, and he was convicted. Now, the case went to the Supreme Court on the ground that he'd been deprived of habeas corpus, but the Supreme Court decided that this didn't apply and it was okay. And the second case, notorious case, is in 1905, the governor of Idaho was assassinated, Frank Sternberg, and he'd been very anti-labor when he was governor. So he called in the Pinkertons because they thought that the motive for the murder must be labor getting its own back. And they arrested the three main leaders of the Western Federation of Miners, one of whom was the most inspiring leader of the industrial workers of the world, the revolutionary movement. So there was a famous trial. They all got off. Clarence Darrow, the famous defense attorney, took on the defense, and he won the case for the defense. But the thing is that the alleged offense was in Caldwell, Idaho, but the three men were in Denver, Colorado, and there was no way in which the Idaho police could arrest somebody in Colorado. So the Pinkertons went in, did exactly the same thing. They kidnapped them, they put them on a train, and the train had to stop for water and coal from time to time. They did it in very remote locations and smuggled them into, Idaho. It was in Utah. Took them into Utah, and then they were put on trial. Now, if you look at some of the more recent practices of the FBI, kidnapping alleged terrorists and taking them to other locations to be imprisoned and interrogated, that's kind of precedent. And some historians have emphasized that as an important precedent, what the Pinkertons did. Some debate about this, I think, because there's such a long interval between the Pinkertons doing that and extraordinary rendition. That's what the CIA called it. But there clearly is some precedence there. And they might be useful if for example, extraordinary rendition were challenged in the Supreme Court. There's a Supreme Court decision in the 19th century which maybe will uphold the practices of the CIA. So there are quite a few examples of that. But the very idea also of a national police force, Pinkerton was very strong on this, but he wanted to be person in charge, and he wanted it to be a private enterprise serving the federal government, a national police force. He advocated that. And he would not have been so keen on public institutions, such as the FBI and the CIA, which are operated on a non-profit basis, paid for by the taxpayer and all the rest of it.
Pinkerton was obsessed with controlling the narrative, writing wild accounts which were part fact, part fiction. As a historian, how did you sort through truth and myth?
I think people often ask me that because I write about espionage as well, and there's a lot of deception going on. But it is a standard practice for a historian, I think, to try to disentangle myth and reality. It's not just Pinkerton. Pinkerton, as you say, was a tremendous propagandist. He wrote all these books in the 1870s. He did use shadow writers because he'd had a stroke in 1869 and he found it difficult to write. But I think there's little doubt that the material comes from Pinkerton, and they are Pinkerton narrative. So he did go the extra mile in presenting an image of himself. And I think it was partly for commercial reasons. This is good for business to portray himself as the person who'd captured various bank robbers and solved all these crimes and so on. So what I'm saying is that it is a challenge for any historian. For example, if you read someone's autobiography, every autobiography is carefully modelled by the person writing it to give a particular account of their lives. And Pinkerton does this writ large, as it were. So when you look at accounts he gave, for example, he wrote an account of his saving of Abraham Lincoln in 1861. You ask yourself, is that all true? Now, in that particular case, the documents survive because people had a great interest in this and people have kept the documents. And his account is more or less true. his saving of Lincoln in 1861. We'll take a slightly later episode when he worked for General McClellan, who was Lincoln's general in charge of the Army of the Potomac, the main Union Army, in 61-62. Then his account there, which argues that he was the first head of a U.S. Secret Service. That's just nonsense. There was no such thing as the U.S. Secret Service. He was a private detective offering his services on a commercial basis to the leading Union general. And the actual Secret Service isn't founded until President Lincoln's last cabinet meeting before he was assassinated, when he established the U.S. Secret Service to deal with counterfeiting. So you take that to the pinch of salt. Equally, his account that suggests that the intelligence he obtained in the Civil War was vital to the conduct of the Northern Campaign is absolute rubbish, because he grossly exaggerated the strength of the Confederate army, and McClellan did the same. Because McClellan was very afraid of being defeated by Robert E. Lee. In fact, McClellan continuously had a much stronger force than Robert E. Lee, but he was very cautious about going in case, against a good general like Lee, in case he was outmaneuvered and lost his reputation. Now, this was absolute disaster, because there was a point early in the Civil War when the Army of the Potomac, the Union Army, could have crushed the Confederate Army, and it would be all over, saving all those lives and suffering. Although you could ask the question, would slavery have been abolished if that happened? Because it was only when the casualties began to mount that people saw that the war needed a higher cause, and that higher cause was the abolition of slavery. Could one argue that Pinkerton prolonged the Civil War by exaggerating enemy strength? I think that there's some doubts about that, because while he did exaggerate the numbers, he did so because he knew that McClellan wanted them to be exaggerated. McClellan, I think, was the person chiefly culpable. And Pinkerton really lacked the experience. He was a good detective, but he lacked the experience to do proper espionage in the South and to find out, and especially to put the numbers together. He didn't have that experience. It's a complex matter, finding exactly what enemy strength is. And so he delivered what in modern parlance is called intelligence to please, a bit like the CIA just now with the capacity of Iran to produce nuclear weapons.
The Pinkertons are kind of what comes to mind when people think of detective work, right? Film, TV, radio, and them wearing disguises and pretending to be other people to infiltrate groups and organizations. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, yes, that was what Pinkerton tried to do. In some ways, that's easier said than done, to get someone to infiltrate like that, because outsiders are so conspicuous by their differences. A notorious example is the J. Edgar Hoover was very opposed to the civil rights movement in America, but when he tried to penetrate some of the black organizations, he sent in white detectives, not only white detectives, but guys in white shirts, wearing ties, with polished shoes. If you want to do that, you've got to have people who are like the people you're trying to penetrate. And that's not always easily done, especially in who is FBI, which is notoriously reluctant to employ African Americans. Now, an example of how it does work is James McParland, I mentioned earlier, penetrated an organization he claimed existed was Molly Maguire's. He could pass off as an Irish worker in Pennsylvania. There were lots of Irish there, just like himself. He was also a very heavy drinker, and they were heavy drinking people, and he would meet them in bars and extract their secrets from him because he was what is called a cold soak, which means you can drink a lot but remain relatively sober and still remember what people said to you. So that's an example of how it can be done. You can disguise yourself. That's another way you can do it. But I mean, there's so many disasters. For example, when Pinkerton decided that Jesse James had to be apprehended at any cost, he sent in a Pinkerton detective to Missouri, to try to track him down. And as soon as he turned up, people were asking, you represented yourself as a farm labourer looking for work near the James farm, but why are your hands so soft? You're not an agricultural worker. They should be calloused. They were constantly outwitted. But an example of where Pinkerton was perhaps quite clever was in setting up his women's division under Kate Warren, because women could chat to people without being suspected. Where they were very successful was to befriend the wives and female acquaintances of suspected criminals and obtain information in that way. And they could pass off as the other, as women quite easily, and that succeeded. I mean, if you look at the literature on private detection. And of course, these techniques of disguising yourself can work, and you can learn how to speak with a different accent and all the rest of it. But that's the exception rather than the rule, I think. I think American detective fiction is a bit more realistic than British detective fiction, in that American detective fiction at least deals with private detectives who do exist in the United States, whereas Sherlock Holmes, for example, Conan Doyle's creation, there weren't any significant private detectives, and it was all police work by that time. So the hard-boiled novel, realistic, a bit more realistic perhaps. There was also kind of technology, of course, eavesdropping. Interestingly, the Pinkertons were opposed to divorce work, I think because Allan Pinkerton was, although he was a patriarch within his own family, he was quite enlightened on women. And he saw, all contemporaries would have agreed with him, that women were the main victims in divorce. You know, the way in which the cases went to courts and all the rest of it, and women were put to shame. So he was against divorce. But the other thing that the Pinkertons were against was eavesdropping, you know, when you put a bug in someone's room to listen to what they say, because that's another way of finding out information. And you find that his sons were the same. The machinery was called different things, dictaphones and all kinds of fancy names they had. The principle was the same. You would leave the device in someone's room and listen in the next room or down the street or something. And Pinkertons wouldn't do that for a long time. And I don't think they really began to use them until the 1930s, when Robert Pinkerton II brought them in. Whereas their competitors did so on a widespread scale. For example, William J. Burns, the detective in charge of the agency which bears his name, which is number 2 to the Pinkertons. They used that all the time. And then they had major contracts with interception companies which could supply the specialized machinery. Then he became the director of the FBI and introduced those methods of eavesdropping to the FBI as well. Then he was disgraced, of course, over the Teapot Dome scandal. But by this time, those techniques had taken roots in the FBI.
When it comes to Kate Warren, kind of the first female detective in the U.S., what did her story tell you about women's roles in this world of secrets and power?
Well, I think Pinkerton was visionary there in that he saw that women had a role to play. Secrecy and power is, that's a major question, really, because so many important decisions were taken for reasons were withheld from women in society in general. And knowledge is power, of course. So if you keep something secret, then you're retaining power in your own hands. I suppose that Pinkerton made a contribution there in that the women themselves were empowered through being detectives, I'm sure. I think it's a contribution in a particularly defined field rather than being a contribution to society at large. There are later on women detectives of some note, especially Grace Humiston, I mentioned in my book. She operated at the start of the 20th century. She started by setting up a bureau to provide legal services for poor people. But then she became involved in detective work. She was involved in a famous murder case in New York City, where it turned out that the murderer was not the person the police fingered, but was a police trustee. She was a top-class detective. And she was recognized because then they took her on. It was realized that corruption was a problem in the NYPD, and they tried to do something about it, and they put her in charge of investigating corruption in the NYPD did this, appointed their own person to investigate corruption. And that's a kind of modern stereotype, isn't it? Someone within the police force investigates corruption at the top. So that's another example of a woman in a particular circumstance who overcomes aspects of secrecy and is empowered by doing so. But I don't think I would want to exaggerate the effects of his proto-feminism on society at large.
Pinkerton really changed the game with surveillance and intelligence, and he really created something lasting. How have we been inspired by him or influenced by him in the stories we tell about detectives and private security, and also the people or the technology that we trust?
Well, I think the question rises as to how well known Pinkerton is today. I live in Scotland, and you'd think that there'd be widespread recognition of the fact that Scotland was the birthplace of a person regarded as the greatest ever private detective, well, rightly or wrongly. And yes, you do meet people who scratch their heads and think, oh yes, I remember now. But he's really kind of passed out of... If you mention Andrew Carnegie, who's another Scot, everybody knows who Carnegie is because he endowed so many schools and libraries in Scotland as well as in the United States. I think that's in America too. Pinkerton has slipped slightly out of the public consciousness. Yeah, there are lots of knowledgeable people who know who he was. So, rising from your question, can you really have a major cultural impact if people have forgotten about you? So then you have to ask the question, are there any intermediate transmitters of Pinkertonism? Now, if you take the case of Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle, who was the writer of the Sherlock Holmes stories, was a great admirer of Allan Pinkerton and continued to be in touch with his family after Allan Pinkerton died. And he wrote a book called The Valley of Fear, which was about the Molly Maguire episode, because he so admired Pinkerton and also James McParlin. And this, of course, also became a movie with the James Bond actor Sean Connery. So you can see these threads are coming through. Then I suppose that you have other detective agencies like the Burns Agency. They help to perpetuate a very similar image. Burns was never a Pinkerton detective, but he was in the same mold, really. Then you have Dashiell Hammett, who wrote a book called The Red Harvest, which was based on his experience as a Pinkerton in Butte, Montana. And then he invents he's probably the main inventor of the hard-boiled fiction genre. So, it's not a direct, not like the laying onto the hands by the Pope to the next successor. But you can see these chords linking the past with the present, even if the name of Pinkerton is not quite as well known as it used to be.
I mean, you even have the symbol for the Pinkertons, the eye.
Yes.
But it's like that private eye symbol.
Yeah, detectives were using that before, but he made it his brand. So you associate the private eye with Pinkerton. And his stationery, always had this eye on top of it. The eye that never sleeps.
I was just in Chicago last weekend, and like the last event that we had for this, it was kind of like a whole festival. And the last event was going to Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. Yeah, I took pictures, so I got the photos of his grave, and then you got Warren and I can't remember his last name, but
Webster.
Yes.
Those are two non-Pinkertons buried there. I mean, there is commemoration in Chicago. In the place of the Haymarket explosion, for example, 1886. But Pinkerton himself had been dead, of course, for 2 years when that occurred. But the Pinkerton brand certainly to the forefront, because it was a Haymarket detective, Andrew Johnson, whose testimony convicted the anarchists of throwing the bomb in Chicago that killed those policemen. Some of them were executed. Those who survived and were still in prison were then pardoned by Governor Altgeld of Illinois on the ground that it was just fabricated evidence. It was not the finest hour in the history of the Pinkerton Agency. And anyway, they have a memorial in Chicago Square. It's called something else now, showing it's a reconstruction of the platform from which the anarchists were speaking shortly before the explosion.
when I go back, I'll have to check that out too. What do you hope readers walk away with after reading your book?
I hope that they'll have some kind of appreciation of who Pinkerton was. I mean, I think that there's a kind of a human interest aspect to writing biographies. But I hope also that there'll be a cautionary tale about how private security came into existence and what some of the pitfalls are. Without condemning it, it's got its place. It has its place in society. But I hope that there'll be some consciousness raising there.
What do you think about Pinkerton?
Well, I don't particularly like him. No, I think he was a pretty unpleasant character. I wouldn't like to deal with someone like Pinkerton. I think he generally had some principles, and you've got to admire him for that.
Well, I'm always curious about, like, when a historian, you're writing about somebody, but then also what your personal opinion is. As much as you want to keep it unbiased, it's hard.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the facts, you can always just write the facts, and like your personal opinion is. There's
a question that arises here, which is, can you write a good biography which is not sympathetic? So if someone writes a biography of Hitler, let's say, there's several of them, how can you write that while getting your reader to kind of empathize enough that they see what this character is about? It's a challenge. If you're writing about someone that you admire, that's an easier task in a way. I was on a bit of a mission because my grandfather was a coal miner who was blacklisted, and definitely informing on him. He was blacklisted throughout Wales, walked through Wales, through England, blacklisted in every pit in Scotland, and there's some personal background there. He then, by the way, became a professional pool player, which is like snooker player, which is like pool, and a hustler. He was literally strapped for cash, no money whatsoever. go to one community, play badly until someone plays money, play well, take the proceedings, and move on to the next town. Then the story goes that he put all his money on a horse, which, because of his underworld contacts, he knew was sure to win, but it didn't. At that point, he took the pledge, which means he never touched a drop of alcohol again after that. The untold story there, which is my grandmother. She was left in charge of the two girls after they'd been evicted from their house at mining village and so on. So she had a hard life.
Did the coal mining, so was the last generation your grandpa?
No. My mother always thought of herself as a coal miner's daughter. That is her self-identification. But yeah, I had an uncle who was a coal miner. And he then became a union leader. And then the coal industry was nationalized, and they became an industrial relations officer. They took the poacher and made him into the guy who catches poachers. He crossed sides.
No, I mean, that's really cool that you come from that perspective, because it's important. I'm sure, yeah, you wanted to know, right? Like, how was it to infiltrate or get into the world of labor unions, and what was it like back then?
I looked into that quite a bit because I wrote an earlier book on surveillance in Britain and America. So I had a fair amount to say about surveillance in this country, in Britain and in Scotland, as well as in the United States.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
This was a lot of fun.
Yes, I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Rhodri, and thank you for writing more about Pinkerton, and I learned a lot.
It's a really good book.
Thank you.
We'd like to thank Rhodri for being on the show today. As he said, Pinkerton was a man of contradictions. If you want to dive deeper into this story, be sure to pick up his book, Allan Pinkerton, America's Legendary Detective and the Birth of Private Security. It's available now wherever you get your books, and we'll also post a link to it in the episode's show notes.
Now that's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. As always, you can find us on social media. We are on TikTok, X, and Instagram, as well as Threads. And you can subscribe to us wherever it is that you get your podcasts, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Good Pods, CastBox. You can find us anywhere. We'll be back again in 2 weeks with a brand new episode of Bound by the Cloak. Thanks for listening.
Until next time.